welcome to this event. This is called an Inconvenient Truth or a Load of Hot Air, organised in association with the Royal Academy of Engineering. We're going to be filming this event, by the way, so if you don't want to be on the tape, then try and sit somewhere behind the camera, and you won't appear anywhere near it. So not over here, basically. Sit somewhere over there. Now, the reason that we're sort of sitting here is because we want to sort of, you're interested people in trying to find solutions to climate change. If we're assuming that climate change is happening, and we're here not to discuss whether it is happening or not, we're kind of starting on the base that the scientists are pretty much correct on this front, that there is climate change happening. It is due to human-induced CO2 emissions and other greenhouse gases. So what do we do about it now? Which is where engineers really come into their fore. And I think that in the last few years, this debate really has picked up a lot of momentum. I mean, scientists and engineers have known about this for decades, perhaps, but with films like Al Gore's An Inconvenient Truth and Nicholas Stern's report, politicians and members of the public have really accepted, I think, and started to debate what we do about this. We've got Copenhagen, the UN FCC meeting coming up in just a few weeks, where a lot of these discussions around what we do about carbon emissions are really going to be discussed. And so it's interesting to have this debate. What can we really do about carbon emissions? To talk about this stuff, of course, we've got an esteemed panel, and we're going to be looking at a whole range of things, where we could radically re-engineer our energy systems, or we could do things at home by not using as much energy. We can and hopefully our speakers are going to tell you some interesting tips or some things to think about when it comes to reducing our overall environmental footprint. Now, before I introduce the speakers, I'm going to get you to do some voting. Now, you've noticed that there are these boxes on your chair. Now, these allow you to vote depending on what's on these screens here. So I'm just going to explain how this works. When there's going to be, every few seconds or so, there'll be a question put up there, and you will be able to sort of answer with a strongly agree, slightly agree, neither disagree nor agree, slightly agree, or strongly disagree. Don't worry about that for a moment. What we're going to do first is test these things out. So there's going to be a test question up there, as you can see. The question is, what tube station did you arrive at tonight? Press 1 if you arrived at Gloucester Road, 2 if you arrived at South Kensington, and 3 if you arrived at another. Now, you can only vote in a 15-second window when I say vote, because they don't switch it on before that. So if we switch the voting on now, and you press 1, 2, or 3, in 15 seconds we'll find out where most of you came. And then we'll go on to the actual voting straight after that. So when the answers are ready, they'll appear on the screen. Let's see which way you all came from. Okay, so vote now, yeah? There's a handy thing there flashing just to remind you to vote now. You've got 15 seconds for all these questions, which I'll read out, and they'll be on there as well. So the answers are in now, I'm hoping. Yeah? Okay, so exactly 38% on South Kensington and Gloucester Road. That's amazing. I think well, only 44 of you voted, but that's okay. So now we'll go on to the actual quiz. There's 6 questions here, and we're going to ask you these 6 questions now and after you've heard the speakers. So the first question is, it would be easy for me to halve my family's transport mileage. So press 1 if you strongly agree, 2 if you slightly agree, 3 if you are ambivalent, 4 if you slightly disagree, and 5 if you strongly agree. So vote now. You've got 15 seconds to vote, and then the answers will pop up. How many people do we have here? So we just know whether everyone's voted. It's about 50 or so. Oh, there we go. Okay, so here we are. Strongly agree. 3% of you feel that you could halve your family's transport mileage. 15% maybe. 11%. Most of you, though, think that you wouldn't be able to do it. 68% of you. Okay, let's move on to the next question. The next question is, if everyone did their bit to reduce carbon emissions, we would get out of this crisis. The numbers are exactly the same this time. Strongly agree, slightly agree, neither disagree or agree, slightly disagree or strongly disagree. You can start voting now. There you go. As soon as it says vote now, that's when you can vote. If everyone did their bit to reduce carbon emissions, we would get out of this crisis. And the answer, oh, you have to vote again, apparently. So, one more time, everyone. One more time, everyone. Vote now. There you go. Technology never quite works first time round, which is maybe something we should discuss later. We've got 15 seconds. If everyone did their bit to reduce carbon emissions, we would get out of this crisis. Okay. So, interesting. It's a sort of inverse normal distribution there. Okay. The next question. The government doesn't give us enough information on how to reduce our household energy consumption. Same questions this time, and you can start voting now. The government doesn't give us enough information on how to reduce our household energy consumption. Okay, votes are in. Okay, so 29% of you think that that's true. Most of you think that the government doesn't give you enough information. Okay. Question number 4. Show me the money and I'll insulate my loft and put solar panels on the roof. The questions are, again, 1 to 5, and you can start voting now. You don't have a loft. Okay. All right. So show me the money and I'll insulate my loft and put solar panels on the roof. Oh, right. Well, more than half of you think that that's a good idea. I agree with you, actually. Okay. Next question. We need nuclear power. I can't believe people can't see how green it is. Questions 1 to 5. You can start voting now. I wonder what this is going to turn out. This is always what splits environmentally friendly types. Okay. We need nuclear power. I can't believe people can't see how green it is. And the answers? Oh, well, okay. So around half of you think that you need nuclear power, and maybe a third think that it's not true. Okay, the final question. I'd be prepared to cut down eating meat by half to reduce methane emissions. Vote now. I'd be prepared to cut down eating meat by half to reduce methane emissions. Lord Stern recently said that you have to become vegetarian to tackle climate change. I'm not sure that I'd be able to do that. And the answers will come up in just a second. Would you give up meat? Oh, goodness. You would. Most of you really want to give up eating meat. Wow, that's quite a sacrifice. Okay, well, we're going to come back to those questions at the end of the session. Let's see if any of the results change after you've heard our 3 speakers. So the first of our speakers is going to be talking about energy. She is Dr. Sue Ian. She was Group Director of Technology at British Nuclear Fuels from 1992 to 2006. She's member of the Council for Science and Technology and represents the UK on committees including the United States Department for Energy Advisory Committee on Nuclear Energy and the Euratom Science and Tech Committee. She's also a Fellow of the Royal Academy of Engineering and a visiting professor at Imperial College. Sue.
Many thanks, Alok. may surprise you that what I won't do this evening is argue the toss for nuclear energy, even though a fair bit of my background was actually in that arena. What I'll be talking about is energy generally and setting nuclear into context within that energy challenge. And since I might want to point to some things, I'll point that way so that the camera can pick up where I'm going to point. But otherwise, I'll try and speak to all of you. First of all, in looking at what we need to do to get a low-carbon economy, life hasn't changed much, really, since the very early days of mankind. We've got earth, air, fire and water at our disposal to harness to try and give us the energy that we need. And when we're looking at low-carbon energy, to utilise earth, air, fire and water in a carbon-friendly way, then we're looking at nuclear energy, at wind energy, at biomass and at hydro. Just out of interest, in terms of carbon footprint, nuclear energy has about the same carbon footprint as wind energy on a kilowatt per kilowatt or a megawatt per megawatt basis. So 4 sorts of large-scale energy types of a low-carbon type to try and give us what we need. But we've a really big challenge ahead of us. We're trying to stabilise the carbon dioxide within the atmosphere at between 450 and 500 parts per million by 2050. And we have to migrate to that low-carbon economy in a way that is robust from an engineering standpoint. So it's no good economists or politicians, urging us and telling us what the targets ought to be and how we ought to be doing better without actually taking into account the engineering challenge that we have ahead of us. And if we look at what's happening in the world as a whole, because here in the UK we're very fortunate people in that we are well into an industrialised, developed economy. In parts of the world like India and China, there are millions of people who haven't got access to anything like the same amount of energy we have. So in the developing world, where people are aspiring to have the same sorts of lifestyles that we have, their energy usage is orders of magnitude less than ours. So, as the world starts to equalise and bring up to speed those in the developing economies, energy demand is going to grow significantly internationally, and delivering that in a low-carbon way is really important. So, when you look at access to energy and productivity, then you look at countries like the US, Australia, the United Kingdom. The more energy you have, the more prosperous you are. So increasing prosperity goes alongside increasing access to energy. And as countries like China and India climb up that prosperity scale, then they'll be looking at orders of magnitude greater demand in their energy than they have currently. So from a political imperative, based on what we read in the newspapers every day, what we see on the telly every day, people have started to really understand the importance of climate change, of having low carbon targets, of figuring out how to do that. Our government has put many policies in place over the last 4 or 5 years in terms of renewables strategy, low carbon transition plans, several energy white papers, but absolutely no analysis of how to deliver the engineering assets on the ground to make those happen. So targets, aspirational, urging us to do better, but no idea how we're actually going to deliver what's needed. So, business as usual, some very eminent people looked at what was going to happen with carbon dioxide concentrations out into the future unless we did something. Business as usual says it's just going to continue to climb. If we deploy wind energy on a sensible scale, it comes down. If we deploy nuclear on a sensible scale, it comes down further. If we have carbon capture and sequestration, we can just about level off and keep things no worse than they are currently. But it's going to take an awful lot to actually deliver those wedges. And my argument to you tonight is that it's not a question of wind or nuclear or carbon capture or solar or biomass. We need every single one of those low carbon energy sources to give us both energy security and low carbon. So looking at things in a stark, cold way, by 2015, we're going to have a shortfall here in the UK in terms of the capacity of our electricity generation to deliver what we need as a country because of our retiring nuclear stations and our retiring coal stations. So in order to plug that gap, you need 16 nuclear power stations or 10,000 wind turbines. So these are the sort of figures that we're looking at in terms of what we need going forward. This is a block diagram that shows us where we use our energy in the UK and where the carbon contribution comes. And you'll see that most of it comes from the transport sector by using petrol and oil in our cars and lorries, and by burning gas in our homes to heat the homes and heat water. The electricity part, which is the lurid purple part of the diagram, is actually a smallish proportion of the total carbon problem. And within that purple block, about 60% at the moment is not low carbon. Okay, so we've got a problem here in that our low carbon energy at the moment is a small proportion of the total. And if we're going to stop using oil as the principal means to move our cars and our lorries around, and we're going to stop using gas to heat our homes and heat our water, then it's going to have a massive consequence for electricity demand here in the UK. Our electricity demand is going to rocket, and we've got to figure out how to provide that in a low-carbon way. Now, apart from the carbon problem, we've also got an energy security problem. Gas has been very good at plugging the gap. We burn gas to create electrical energy. About 30% of our electrical energy these days comes from burning gas in power stations. And while we had North Sea oil and gas reserves, maybe that wasn't too big a problem. But look at where the reserves of oil and gas are, mainly Russia and the Middle East. And 2020, this shows you the extent of world movements. So look at the difference between 2005 and 2020 in terms of gas moving around the world. Mainly in pipelines from Russia and LNG transports from the Middle East. And we're now net importers. So we're very vulnerable to other countries owning the sources of the very fuel that we need. So from a security of supply standpoint, as well as a carbon standpoint, we've got a real problem. Looking at our generation sources, you'll see that, that nuclear at the moment is about 18% of our use. You'll see that renewables is actually still a small slice. And even with all the efforts taken to try and increase our wind, most of the renewables contribution is made up from hydro and landfill gas. Wind hasn't yet started to deliver a lot in terms of our primary energy use. I mean, hopefully, with a big expansion in offshore wind, that will change in the future. But the engineering challenge ahead in delivering much more offshore wind is massive. When you consider the North Sea in force 8 gales in October, November, December, then the engineering challenge in building our offshore wind farms and ensuring they operate reliably with high availability it's great for engineers because it's going to be a wonderful challenge, but it's not insignificant. So as our nuclear stations retire, we've got a huge problem in trying to plug that gap. And right now, this is the retirement profile for our nuclear stations. By just beyond 2020, we've only got one left that's only providing 3% of our energy. So without more nuclear power stations, we've got a security of supply problem, and our carbon problem is much worse than it is currently. So when we look at the energy flow charts for 2 years ago, most of the fossil fuel is going into the transport sector and into our homes to give us low-grade heat. We've only got tiny amounts of wind and biomass that make a meaningful contribution. As we look to decarbonise our economy, to massively uplift the amount of wind energy and the amount of biomass and reduce the amount of fossil fuel, what we do is create a massive issue for our grid. So not only are we going to have to shift the balance of power stations that we have, but we also have to upgrade our grid infrastructure very significantly to deliver this low-carbon energy. And the extent to which we need much more in the way of nuclear energy or clean coal, carbon capture and sequestered coal, these are very significant numbers. We're not talking about 1 or 2 power stations here. We're talking about 50, 60, 70 power stations of this type in order to deliver the low carbon energy that we need. That's just keeping demand as it is. If we reduce demand significantly, and I know Joanna's going to talk quite a bit about that, then you can start to reduce the extent of the problem a bit. You don't need quite as many power stations, and the problems associated with the grid are not quite as high, but they're still there. This diagram shows you what happens if transport is electrified and we reduce demand by 35%. If our low-grade heat is electrified instead, then again we can see significant benefits in terms of maintaining a sensible balance of the sort of energy that we need. But in every single scenario going forward, we need a massive uplift in wind energy offshore, and we need a massive uplift in nuclear energy and carbon capture and sequestration. So huge changes ahead of us over the next 3 or 4 decades if we're to continue to have the lifestyles that we have, and if we're going to play our role in having a low-carbon economy. So that's my message for you. Lots of challenge ahead. We're going to reduce demand, and even when we reduce demand, we've still got to have a significant amount of nuclear energy, clean coal, and wind energy in our mix.
Professor Kemp is in the engineering department at Lancaster University. He's spent almost 30 years in the rail industry before that, though, including work on the Docklands Light Railway, and he was project director for the consortium building Eurostar. He was later UK Technical and Safety Director for Alstom Transport. He's also a fellow of the Royal Academy of Royal Academy of Engineering, and he's chairing a new academy study on the mass take-up of electric vehicles. Roger.
Thank you. I find it rather bizarre sitting here in the middle of what feels like a cafe, showing you slides. But I'd like to start by showing you a few slides just to set a context. This is oil price. When I looked in the paper yesterday, that oil price had gone up to just under $80 per barrel. As you can see, we had the peak last year, everyone can remember. This year, so far we haven't had the peak. Most people expect it to keep on going up. And as Sue has pointed out, most of our energy used in transport actually comes from oil, and this is going to be a major problem to us. Earlier this month, The Guardian published an expose that pointed out the International Energy Agency had been, shall we say, economical with the truth over how much oil actually is in the ground. And this is a response to the editor of The Guardian from Colin Campbell, who's one of the people thinking about peak oil. As you can see, he's showing there that in his view, peak oil basically comes around now. Now, maybe he's wrong. Maybe it's 10 years later. Maybe it's 15 or 20 years later. But even so, it is very, very close. And this is going to make a major change to how much oil we have, therefore what price we have to pay for it, and what availability there is for transport. Because everybody's here tonight, I assume that I don't need to discuss climate change and everything else. But temperature's going up, people know what's got to be done. It's relatively simple. We just need to make at least an 80% reduction in CO2. And if you talk to politicians, they'll say, oh, that's fine, yes. Technology and engineers will solve it. So here you have a number of engineers who possibly are not entirely convinced that that is going to be quite as easy as some politicians would like us to think. I plotted here CO2 emissions. Now, there is a bit of ambiguity about what the difference is between CO2, CO2 equivalent, and so on. And as you can see, industry is coming down, domestic is coming down, mainly due to the dash for gas, conversion from coal to gas. The other, I'm not quite sure what's in it, but it's basically the same. And transport is going up. And it has been going up for the last 40 years, and if we're not careful, it will continue to go up. Looking at the official statistics, people are saying we're meeting our Kyoto targets, our emissions are coming down. Dieter Helm, a couple of years ago, did this paper where he compared what was officially in the statistics with actually the energy that's being, or the emissions that are being produced for us. So just because we've exported industry to China doesn't necessarily mean we're no longer responsible for the emissions of the industry making the things that we as consumers use. And he was showing that if yellow there is the bit that's the official government statistics, by the time you add into it tourism, you add into it the embedded energy and what comes from China, in fact, as a community, our energy consumption is going up and not down. And so not only have we got to start from a sort of level playing field, we've actually got to go from permanently going up. So basically what Dieter has been showing is that our total emissions are going up. We now have to reverse that and make them go down. And this is going to be exceptionally challenging. Looking at transport by itself, I have here a graph that shows emissions over the last 30 years or so. And you can see it's been going up from mid-1950s almost consistently to now. The blue line shows land transport. The red line shows total transport if you include also air and sea. And what I did here was to extrapolate the total transport emissions. Now, this is a fairly dodgy thing to do. Those of you who are good on spreadsheets and things will probably recognise I just put those numbers into Excel and said, now please extrapolate for the next 30 years using whatever formula seems vaguely appropriate. So I'm not arguing that this is actually an accurate figure as to where we're going, but it shows the sort of general indication as to where we're going to start from and where we're going to finish. So compared with 1990, and we want to make an 80% reduction vis-a-vis 1990, we actually have to be making something like a 92% reduction vis-a-vis where we would be if we were allowed business as usual to continue. And this is pretty scary. 90% reduction in emissions if we're going to meet the sort of targets that have been embodied into last year's Climate Change Act. One way that politicians have been looking at this is possibly to use biofuels. This is a calculation, I'm not saying this is typical of all biofuels, but it's a calculation done by Unilever, looking at the total emissions produced during the production and combustion. And as you can see, the blue line, gasoline, the gloomy red one next to it, ethanol, diesel, and soybean. And so, in effect, for those particular emissions, there is really very little benefit in moving towards biofuels, because doing that, you still get emissions. Now, obviously, there are more efficient ways of doing things. Sugarcane is a very efficient way of making biofuels. It's just unfortunate it involves destroying rainforests, and there are all sorts of other issues that come along there. So I think we can rule out biofuels as being a way of weaning ourselves off oil. Sue has talked already about renewable energy, and here are just some pictures showing renewable energy within European countries. The dark blue line in the middle is the EU as a whole. The other lines, different countries. United Kingdom, we're not quite as bad as Malta, but we're pretty well at the bottom of the spectrum. So, as Sue has pointed out, we have an awful long way to go if we're going to get up our level of renewable energy, and if we're going to transfer our huge transport growth into renewables. This is going to be particularly challenging. I think it is worth asking the question whether politicians have actually got the message. And for 5 days, when he was first involved in being Prime Minister, I thought that Gordon Brown probably had. 20th of November 2007, it seemed a good idea. By 26th of November 2007, I felt that perhaps he was slightly off message. And I'm not entirely sure where our policy is now. So that's just a bit of background as to what we're looking for. And I'd now like to think about what are we going to do to actually reduce emissions by that much. We can rule out biofuels. Personally, I believe we can rule out modal shift. Modal shift is where you say, oh great, we'll all go by train instead. Now, as you have seen from my CV, I've actually spent most of my life working on trains, and I think generally they're a good thing because they pay my pension. But at the moment in Britain, they represent about 10% of the total passenger kilometres, freight kilometres. Are we really going to say, fine, no problems, we will multiply the size of our railways by 10, and then we'll all go by train rather than by car? That is going to be quite a major challenge. It's also a major challenge to look at your freight transport. That, yes, there's a lot of good reasons for putting long-haul freight onto rail. But frankly, that is not very much of the total market. The big issue is always going to be, what do you do about relatively short-haul freight from the warehouse in Milton Keynes through to the shop in Oxford Street or somewhere? Are you really going to run a freight railway to Marks and Spencer's in Oxford Street? And if you can't do that, we have got to find some way of having a no-carbon or very, very low-carbon transport system for freight as well. But let's just look at the easy questions. Let's look at the problems of passengers and people. Most cars at the moment run on petrol, diesel. We have got to somehow reduce that. There's not much we can do about the petrol fuel itself. We can't find many other liquid fuels. So perhaps then we go to electric vehicles. This is possible, and we're looking at this in the Royal Academy at the moment as to the ways that we can move people from petrol cars into battery cars. But it is going to be a very different experience. Certainly, it's easy enough to build a battery car with a range of 20 miles and a top speed of 30 miles an hour. It's a sort of student project. It's a bit more challenging to build a battery car with a range of perhaps 50 miles and a top speed of perhaps 60 miles an hour. That becomes something that's entirely possible. The price goes up. If you start saying, well, I would really like something that would allow me to go from here to Manchester and back without recharging, then yes, of course it's possible. It would just cost you £30,000. It'd be hugely expensive, very heavy. And the big challenge is that whereas a container for petrol to go from here to, say, Plymouth and back costs 20 quid, a container for electrical energy to go from here to Plymouth and back probably costs about £20,000 and is much bigger and much heavier. And so I think we have a situation where the technology is there, but we have not got a technology that is a direct replacement for petrol. We have a technology that will allow us to make short trips, and this, I think, is going to be a big challenge to the community that we're in and a way of actually reducing the total mileage we travel. It will mean living closer to our place of work. It'll mean not considering that it's entirely normal to drive to Birmingham back just to go to a pop concert or something. It will involve a lot of radical rethinking of how we actually use a car. We can continue using cars, and I look forward to owning an electric vehicle when I can actually afford one, but I think we're going to find that they are not a direct replacement for the gasoline that we have at the moment, and there will be a major change to our lifestyles and to our assumptions that we make about transport. And I think I will finish there.
Today is Joanna Yarrow, who's going to be hopefully giving us some tips about how we ourselves can reduce our carbon footprints by reducing our energy use. She's one of Britain's leading experts in green living and specialises in helping people put environmental principles into practice. She presented BBC Three's Outrageous Wasters, is GMTV's eco-expert and author of 1001 Ways You Can Save the Planet and How to Reduce Your Carbon Footprint. Her third book, Ecological, has just been published. Joanna was also founder of the sustainability consultancy Beyond Green.
Thank you. Hi everyone. I feel slightly out of place in that I'm not an engineer, so please forgive me that. I do work with a lot of engineers though. And I fear also, stand up, sorry. I fear that I may be teaching all of you to suck eggs tonight in talking about how to reduce your own carbon footprint at home, but that was my remit. So forgive me if I'm saying the blindingly obvious. I do sometimes feel that having done this for quite a long time now, I'm sort of peddling old rope, but it is still amazing, isn't it, how many people don't make the connection between these big and scary issues that are in the newspapers, on the news, pretty much every single day now, and the way we live. So that's what I do on a day-to-day basis. And I'm sure we're all very familiar with the figures these days, but I think sometimes it's just worth taking a moment to revisit the scale of the challenge, and we've heard some of that already from Sue and Roger. But there's a piece of maths called Factor 10, which goes a bit like this. If you add together projected population growth, about 6.5 billion of us now, 9 billion by 2050, and fairly conservative economic growth estimates. I know they've been a bit slow recently, but the economy is still growing. Just to have the impact that we are having on the biosphere now today, which we know is unsustainable, by 2050, we'll need to do absolutely everything at least 10 times more efficiently. So that means in the way that we got here tonight, in the way that we produce the drinks we're all quaffing at the moment, in the way we produce the clothes we're all wearing, we have to do all of that at least 10 times as efficiently just to have the impact we're having at the moment on the planet, which we know is unsustainable. So that's the scale of the challenge. So I just sometimes think that's worth scaring yourself with. And it can make you feel rotten, can't it? Because we all are worried about the situation we're in, and we all understand now that most of these problems that the biosphere is facing actually boils down to us and the way we live. And the American writer Wendell Berry summed this up quite nicely. Every problem that concerns us as conservationists always leads back to the question of how we live. So rather than seeing that as a just way to make yourself feel wretched about your human existence, I like to look at it the other way, something that Thomas Friedman calls the upside of down. Yes, the problems lie in the way that we all do things, but therefore, obviously, the solutions also need to lie in the way we do things. We're not actually trying to do a whole new area of human behaviour and endeavour. We're just trying to alter what we do in this new paradigm we find ourselves in. So what I and my colleagues, and I think all of us working in this sector, are trying to do is to design environments, buildings, places, products and services which actually make it easier and more attractive to live sustainably, because blindingly obvious point, unless we do that, we're not going to get the kinds of changes we need. Just a quick point on offsetting, because I was asked to cover this. Wouldn't it be wonderful if we could just add up our carbon impacts and pay someone to offset the problem for us? Sadly, it just doesn't work like that. The sort of traditional style offsetting, I'm sure you're all aware of, where trees are planted to absorb the carbon that your activities produce, number of floors. Obviously, it can take a tree at least 50 years to absorb that carbon, whereas it takes you maybe 5 hours to fly to New York. We simply wouldn't have enough space to plant all those trees. When the trees die, the carbon is released and so on. The timescales don't match. Also, investing in renewable technologies that avoid the emission of future carbon. Again, a good thing to do, but it's not going to magically suck up that carbon dioxide that our activities just released. So I think, yes, it's a useful concept, and I think, it is a useful thing to invest in for completely unavoidable emissions. But, the facts are, we all know we have got to make some pretty dramatic changes. So how can we do that in ways that do give us the upside of down, that do save us money, that do improve our quality of life, that perhaps make our homes more comfortable to be in, that perhaps bring us closer to our community, that perhaps make us healthier. I'm often asked, can you just give me your top 10 tips for reducing my carbon footprint? Can you just give me a corporate strategy and action plan, a list of things that we can tick off and then we'll be green? I like writing lists and I like bossing people around, but of course diets, a carbon diet in the same way as a low carb diet or any other diet, they don't work if you just take on someone else's list, because we're all different and we're all in a different situation. So if we just try to apply someone else's really strict set of rules for a week or two, perhaps if we really try, we will get some impacts, but we will go back to our old way of life. We'll go back to the things that we care about. We'll take the easy option. We need to find ways of doing this that suit us personally, whether you're a business or you're someone at home. And so I think that that's the real challenge. But to do that, we, of course, need to understand the principles. And there are some basic things that are just fundamental to all of us. So I'm going to talk about some of those tonight. So what we need is we need to work out ways of producing personalised portfolios of lifestyle. So this is a poor victim family that I was working with on one of the BBC programmes. First port of call, I think, as an individual certainly, is to understand where your big areas of impact lie. Because otherwise you can put an awful lot of effort into something that actually isn't going to have much impact. So one area I suggest people often start is with a carbon footprint calculator. There are some great ones online. There are loads of them now. This is just one I think is an easy one to use. It's produced by WWF. It's got the website there at the bottom. And it takes you through your areas of life, including food, travel, homes, and stuff. There you can see what your impact is, where your biggest problem areas are, and it helps you to prioritise and also to log the differences, log the changes, because frankly, it gets a bit tedious. And I think that doing something for a week or a month, if you can then go back, log on again and see the impact you've had, that's a great incentive to keep going. So where are some quick wins for everyone? I'll rattle through these because I've got far too many slides. Well, on a personal level, 4 big areas contributing to your carbon footprint tend to be your energy use in and around the home, the way you travel, the food you eat, and actually the waste you produce can also have a big impact. So I'm going to charge through these. Your home is probably producing about 6 tonnes, or your household about 6 tonnes a year, and through all sorts of uses, a lot of them useful, but a lot of them actually waste. And the Energy Saving Trust estimates that actually we waste about a third of the energy that we use and we pay for in our homes simply by being inefficient. So there's an upside to this, is we could collectively save about £5 billion a year just by using it a bit more carefully. And one of the biggest areas of energy use in our homes, as was touched on before, is actually in heating and cooling. About half of your energy use is going to go into that. So that's a really important place to start. It's really, really unsexy. If anyone knows a sexy way of talking about insulation, please let me know afterwards, because everyone wants the eco bling, don't they? They want something that they can stick on their roof that the neighbours can see and say, wow, aren't they green? They want some new gadget or gizmo. Whereas actually for most of us, keeping our homes warm is one of the most important ways to start. British homes are crap when it comes to energy efficiency. Our European neighbours shame us. So whether it's insulating your loft, just putting that extra layer so you've got at least 27 centimetres of insulation, cavity wall insulation, installing double glazing, or quite simply closing your curtains before it gets dark this time of year, investing a £5 in draft exclusion strip, that alone is probably going to do more than anything else to reduce your basic household carbon footprint. And there are plenty of grants available for doing these things these days. Focusing on your heating, whether it's turning your boiler down a degree or two, making sure your hot water tank is well wrapped, or basically only putting the heating on in the rooms that you're actually in rather than heating the whole house, or putting a woolly jumper on. Again, not sexy, but you're looking at saving yourself several £100s a year through those actions. And increasingly, odd thing to think about as it starts to get colder, but a large amount of energy in the developed world is used on cooling buildings. In the States, in the summer, nearly half of peak energy load goes on air conditioning. And as we do enter a period of climate change, people are in the UK starting to install more air conditioning. So looking at, again, insulation and draft proofing to keep your buildings cool, and thinking about the way you use your homes in that respect is going to become more important. Now, lighting and appliances, I was told not to bang on about light bulbs too much. We do hear about them far too much, but my God, we still make such a fuss and we don't get it right. Lighting and appliances in our homes now uses double the energy it did just 30 years ago, so it's worth thinking about. Lighting, Daily Mail, don't need to go on about light bulbs, but it is worth looking out for, as well as the compact fluorescent bulbs, the new generation of LEDs, light-emitting diodes. They've literally just come on the market in the last year for domestic use, and these last about 100 times longer than traditional bulbs, and can save you over £150 during the lifetime of a bulb. They last longer and they use so much less energy. They're practically unbreakable and now available for all sorts of fittings. Energybulbs.co.uk. I don't get a commission, but they have lots. Appliances, similarly. We hear a lot about turning our appliances off at the wall. If you forget, there are now gadgets that will do that for you. So when you turn something off, it automatically turns off from standby. IntelliPlug and IntelliPanel are two good ones. They're available in John Lewis and B&Q. And simple activities like washing at lower temperatures. If we all washed at 30 instead of 40 degrees, we'd actually save enough energy to power 500,000 homes a year. Worth doing. And then looking out for some of the gadgets coming on the market that just help you to see it and understand those changes. This is one I got at home called the Owl. And what it does is it shows you real time how many pence an hour you're spending on electricity. And believe you me, that doesn't half focus the mind. You get quite obsessed. But if you've got children, again, it's a great way of bringing it to life and helping them get involved. So that's about reducing your energy use in the home. Obviously, we need to think, as we've heard, about where our energy comes from. And still, a lot of people don't realise they have a choice about what type of tariff they use. And there are a growing number of tariffs that actually allow you to use electricity in your home that is from 100% renewable sources. So it's just as simple, comes through exactly the same wires. And if you're not at the stage where you want to invest in home energy generation, that's a good way to do it. The Energy Saving Trust, I'm sure most of you will have heard of, that's the National Energy Saving Advice Body. Their website's brilliant, energysavingtrust.org.uk. Loads of information along these lines about how to do stuff and to help you understand what those savings are. And there's lots of information on there on the grants that are available. We have a terrible system in this country. It's very opaque how you actually get help. And we saw from the voting that a lot of people still feel they don't get enough advice. Well, go onto that website and they will give you some. Waste, very quickly. Recycling, we're starting to get to grips with it. It can seem like a slightly marginal activity, but let's not diss it too much. Actually, even though we're not that great at it, the waste that we do recycle in this country actually avoids carbon emissions because it uses so much less energy to recycle than to produce from scratch. The recycling that we do in the UK is equivalent to taking about 5 million cars off the road. So next time you have a bottle of wine, remember what to do with it. Near the last point here, food. There was a question there about switching to a vegetarian diet. Well, the food that we eat, the way it's produced, the way it's got to us and so on, actually is responsible for about a fifth of our personal carbon footprint. So those 3 meals a day for the rest of your life are great opportunities to reduce your personal impact. whether it's by choosing more local and seasonal food, or even trying to grow your own, and also meat. Startlingly, the global meat industry is responsible for about 18% of worldwide greenhouse gas emissions. That's more than transport. So cutting down the amount of meat that we eat, don't necessarily need to go completely vegetarian, is, I think, a fairly easy but high impact way to reduce your footprint. Transport, we've heard a lot about this, a big and growing contributor to emissions. Just to put this into context, this is the factor 10 thing in action. There were about 500 million cars on the roads in 2000. If you put them into the factor 10 machine, if we carry on with transport growing as it is today, there'll be about 5 billion cars on the road by 2050. 5 billion. So that's not just a load of congestion, it will be. Depending on how they're fueled, obviously, the pollution issue could be larger or smaller. But also just think of the infrastructure that goes into accommodating those cars. Think of the impact on our health systems and so on. I think for me, that is a case in point where, yes, we can look at the technology, but we are actually going to have to think about getting around less, as we heard. Cycling, increasing life expectancy. It's not just about being out in the rain. It can actually improve your quality of life. UK cyclists 10 times more likely to be killed than Danish ones. That's not because they're bad cyclists. I'm afraid it's because we don't cater for low carbon living very well in this country. And this is one of the points that I hope we can discuss a bit when we get to Q&As. It's all very well to ask us to live differently, but we do need to create a context in which we do this. Copenhagen, their weather's actually quite a lot worse than ours, and yet you have about 60% of commuter traffic is by bike. I think it's about 5% in London and way less than that the rest of the UK. And 60% of those cyclists cycle all year round. And that's largely because they design their places, they design their infrastructure to accommodate them. Walking, obviously, good thing. And public transport. Yes, we need to improve it to encourage people onto it. I'm going to speed up because I'm sure I'm out of time. Driving, yes, obviously looking for lower carbon vehicles, but thinking if you do need to drive about how you drive, driving less, using car clubs, car sharing, and so on. And yes, big thorny one. It's not very nice, is it? But we are going to have to fly less. Flying is the fastest growing source of greenhouse gas emissions once you factor in the forcing effect, because emissions are let out higher up in the stratosphere. Some people argue that they're actually clocking up about 15% of Britain's greenhouse gas emissions at the moment. So there are some great websites that I use a lot. One in particular is called themaninseat61.com. There you are, 61.com. And what you can do is you can put in where you want to travel from and where you want to travel to, anywhere in the world, not just the UK, and it will give you the flight-free routes. Brilliant. And this slightly fatuous cartoon here, there she is looking out at the world burning. So apparently changing to energy-efficient bulbs wasn't enough. Obviously, sustainability is about more than just our home. We need to rethink everything, our architecture, the way we organise our finances, the way we organise our cities, and so on, so that we can actually build up a culture of sustainability, embed this in everything we do. And we need to have places, I believe, that put this into practice. It's really hard in the UK because there are so few examples of living a low-carbon lifestyle. You talk about it and people think that you're asking them to live in a cave with the TV switched off. It just doesn't seem very attractive. And we take people by train to Sweden, to Germany, and so on, and where people are actually living and have been living quite a long time now, much closer to the type of lifestyle we're talking about. So I actually, one of the things I do is run a property development company where we're actually designing and hopefully delivering low-carbon communities where you can actually see that this isn't just for beardy tree huggers. And then just a quick point here as I finish. of thinking as individuals, what can we do? So many people say to me, well, it's just not going to make a difference. I personally believe that, yes, it can and does. But I also think that, what we do counts, not only because together all our actions add up, but if you're thinking that politicians need to do their bit, if you're thinking that industry needs to do their bit, they need to take their lead from somewhere. They need to feel that they've got the mandate to act. So us getting involved really gives them that. There are my books. And if you think you're too small to go to bed, if you think you're too small to make a difference, you've obviously never been to bed with a mosquito. That's all I'm going to say. Thank you.
Let's move on to the question and answer session. Here's your chance to ask our panel of experts the things that you think that maybe they've missed out, or maybe the things that you think that they could explain a little bit more. So let's take our first question. Who'd like to ask the first thing? Over here.
I just wondered why so little is being invested in thorium-based nuclear power. It is much more abundant than uranium, and it has none of the negative side effects.
Okay, so the question was about thorium nuclear power. I think, Sue, you're definitely the one to answer this one.
Yeah, but back in the early days of nuclear power, thorium was looked at as the source of fuel. In fact, one of the first reactors in the United States was fueled with thorium fuel. And India, which has very substantial thorium reserves, is actually pursuing work on the thorium fuel cycle pretty vigorously. I think longer term, probably thorium will actually be utilised in nuclear power stations. There's no reason why not. And as you say, there are some significant advantages to it. The barrier at the moment is that the existing industry is geared up to use uranium as its source of material. It's well established. It's relatively cheap. Until uranium reserves start to look as though they're very significantly on the downturn, I don't think we'll see much in the way of thorium fuel used. But longer term, maybe out towards the end of this century, then I think thorium will become a matter of routine.
Okay, there's a question here at the front.
I'm very interested in the sort of resonance between the chat about carbon capture and storage at the moment, that we can just put carbon somewhere safe where it can't talk to the atmosphere and we'll all be fine. I remember in the late 70s when there was this debate about nuclear reprocessing in this country, and the government actually stated in public documents that by the time storage is an issue, the scientists will have solved the problem. Do you see that sort of echo yourself? Can you see a real future for carbon capture and storage, or is it pie in the sky?
So the question, Jeb, was just about whether carbon capture and storage, which everyone talks about now, is the real solution, given that we've talked about this stuff before. Who'd like to take that one on?
Shall I kick off? So far, we've seen carbon capture and storage used at roughly 1% of the power level in a big coal-fired power station. Now, those demonstrations, I'm told, have been sort of fairly satisfactory. But so far, nobody has actually built anything like a full-scale plant. And I find it completely scary, the way that politicians are saying, this is our future, this is what we're going to have, when nobody has even built one. It's a bit like saying we will rely on the motor car for the 20th century, so a few decades before Henry Ford had actually built one. It's one of those things that conceptually it sounds great. Some of the experiments are fine, but at the moment, I don't think there is one.
Yes, there is. Sorry. Hatfield will come on stream in 2030.
It might have, yes, you're saying it may
But
come
there
on
isn't
stream,
one yet, is there?
But that is not a big coal-fired station of the Drax sort of scale.
It's a 900. It's a 900. It's nearly one gigawatt.
Great. Is it working now?
No. Richard Budge, as you may or may not know, owns Hatfield.
Yeah.
He's got the Barnsley seam there. He has started to build his power station. In 2011, it'll go live on gas. That'll give him two income streams, one from his coal, which goes into Drax and Ratcliffe, and the other stream will be his gas. He's got a 50-50 Russian partner to provide the money, and he'll go carbon capture and storage on pre-combustion, not post-combustion, in 2013.
From
and
coal?
I think, yes, it'll be clean coal, it'll go into the North Sea, and I think the price of his power will actually be extremely competitive.
Okay, so that's
I'll certainly welcome that, but at the moment, I'd go back to what I said before, it has not been proven yet.
Okay, Joanna, do you want to add something?
I mean, as I said, I'm not an engineer. I don't know very much about CCS, but I think it's really interesting, isn't it? The way that we grasp onto these solutions, or like the Holy Grail. Obviously, we're in a situation now where the timescales are so short and the scale of the problem so fast, and the trend's going in so dramatically the wrong way. Anyone who's been looking at newspapers today, oh my God. We've known about these problems for so long, and yet over the last 3 years, carbon emissions have been going up by 3% a year, 41% since 1990. We are pitting our technological wits against this, apparently, but we're not getting in the right direction. And again, Thomas Friedman, I talked about earlier in his book, came up with a slightly throwaway, perhaps, phrase, but it stuck in my mind, of beware tilts, terrific, imaginary, low-carbon technologies. Obviously, we're working very hard. Our new technologies are coming online, but we have to work with what we've got. And a lot of what we've got is about changing the way we're doing things rather than waiting for new technologies to save the day.
Okay, we're going to take... yeah.
The question that we were originally asked, I think, had two parts to it. One was about the carbon capture technology, and the other was about the sequestration and the safety case for where the carbon dioxide is eventually pumped. And I think hopefully we will soon see the technology itself demonstrated on the power stations, as indicated by the gentleman on my left there. My concern is that it's not happening fast enough. It could have happened much earlier. It could have been given much more support. Government has talked about demonstrators, and we're still yet to see government actions taken forward. The actions that have been taken forward have been in conjunction with another nation and in the private sector, and that's disappointing. Because if people are serious about carbon capture and sequestration, then we should be pumping money into it to, get it to demonstrated, proven, readily commercialisable state. With respect to pumping the CO2 back into the North Sea or other repositories, then we already do pump carbon dioxide or gas down into what were oil wells, as a means to get better extraction from the oil wells themselves. So there's a double benefit in terms of getting more out of the oil wells that you have and finding a place to sequester gas. I think we have still yet to bottom out the safety cases in full, and it's important that that work carries on in parallel with the actual technology, either pre or post combustion.
Okay, we've got a question. I think we might try and get some more. Maybe we'll come back to nuclear waste. We'll come back to nuclear waste, I think. But let's try and get some more questions from other people. There's one here, and then if there's one... Okay, if you want to get the microphone over, we'll get to the next. So, over here.
Is that me? Yeah. Let me say at the outset, I'm an engineer. I'm a fellow of the Royal Academy of Engineering. So I think in numbers, mostly, and that's what concerns me. If I can just make an observation to start with, it seems to me that the, quote, easy part of this debate is when the climate scientists and the politicians have scared the world into how big a problem it is. And today isn't a day to debate whether that's right or wrong, but certainly that has been achieved. As Sue said earlier, nobody has really said, so how are we going to solve it? And I get extremely frustrated and almost angry with the target-setting culture, when targets are set with no idea how they can be met, zero idea. One of the things that concerns me slightly with what Joanna was saying was, I know you're not an engineer, but I'd love to see some numbers, because there is no way that if everyone did all the things you're talking about, it would have any significant impact on the problem. And so I guess the question, slightly unfairly to my two engineering friends here, is, starting from top down and the numbers which Sue put up, what could be done? What hypothetically could be done to meet the targets? Nuclear power stations, we'd all have to stop flying, we probably wouldn't be able to eat meat, all those things still would not come very close to what has to be done. And if I could just make one last comment, I attended a presentation, which I think Sue chaired, at the Royal Academy recently about the 7 barrage proposals. Now, for those who know about that, if it ever happens, it's an enormous project. It's probably 10 times as big as building the Channel Tunnel. It would have huge environmental impact. It would absorb the whole of the construction industry and so on. So now that must be really, really big. That could really help to solve the problem. How much electricity would it generate? 4% of our usage. 4%. So my question, slightly unfair, let's have a straw man of what sort of things would have to be done to meet these ridiculous targets.
Okay, can I ask Joanna to talk first? Because it sounds quite depressing that our engineer friend there is saying that everything that you're talking about maybe won't make a difference. Do you want to...
Well, first of all, it will make a difference, quite obviously. If we think about the energy use in our buildings, don't have the figures off the top of my head, but something like 40% of our carbon emissions are attributed to energy use in buildings. So whether we're using energy in the home or in the office or in any other kind of building in the UK, if we think about the efficiency of that is going to add up. If we think about the way we travel, whether we're on personal trips or business trips, reducing those trips and taking them in more carbon-efficient ways, yes, that will add up. I think I agree completely, of course. Incremental steps that we make in our homes or our offices are not the whole picture by any means, and that's why I said my point at the end about, obviously that's one part of the jigsaw. I think it's very important that we demonstrate that we are willing to act in our sphere of influence, because I think that has a knock-on mandate to those who are working in other areas of whether it's industry or politics. But again, as I said, I think we need to be addressing the carbon challenge in every area of society. There is no one area of society, there's no one area of human endeavour that's going to solve this for us. And you're quite right. We have these amazingly challenging targets that we know are real, and get more challenging the longer we leave them. And we don't know how on earth we are going to get them. But every piece of, even if it's a percentage point that we can add into that equation, is going to have to be, we're going to have to treat as incredibly important, because right now we're down to matters of years, fractions of decades to make this happen.
Sue,
Yeah.
just to say on the second part of that question, what do you think is the scale of this problem? Are we underestimating it?
I mean, if we leave demand as it is, then it's a massive challenge. Although it is not impossible, because with the combination of wind, existing hydro, new nuclear, and clean coal, you can deliver the power that is necessary cleanly. But it will cost you enormously, because you'll have many more power stations than you actually ought to have. So it'll be reflected in the cost of energy, which the days of cheap energy are gone. I think we all recognise that. But I think it's really important to tackle the demand side, and there is a lot more that can be done formally in that sense than is now. It's unforgivable that our building regulations, don't match the standards that have been employed in Scandinavia, in Switzerland, in Austria for many years now. The new houses that are being built day by day in the UK, are still way short of anything that is properly energy efficient in terms of building. Most of the buildings that will be around at the turn of the next century are already built. So they're like this building. They're like the homes that we already have. They're going to be around. So there is a lot that we can do with existing buildings if there is both public will to accept that change needs to happen and political will to make it happen. I mean, the government at any one given point in time, owns probably 40% of the real estate. And yet, what are they actually doing in terms of the real estate they own to make sure it's brought up to 21st century Scandinavian type building efficiency? So, more could be done than is being done.
Roger, do you want to add anything?
I share your frustration that we have an awful lot of targets with absolutely no idea how we're going to meet them. I mean, just look at the renewable energy targets that we have. 10,000 new offshore turbines, I think was the number I read in some policy paper, to be installed in 10 years. That's something like 1,000 a year. At present, there are only about 100 days a year you can install these things. We're about a factor of 20, 30, 40, 50 short on the number of barges, cranes, everything else we need to do that. So I would think that we can meet things like the objectives of the 2008 Climate Change Act, but only by gearing up on the sort of footing that we had for building Spitfires and Lancasters in the 1930s and 40s. And the idea that somehow private sector will just come and pick this up and do it all just because it's a good thing to do, isn't it? Strikes me as being impossible. But
Okay.
I think it is possible, but I just don't see any evidence that as a society or the political classes have the slightest view as to how really challenging it's going to be.
Okay, there's a question over here.
Andrew Jameson, I'm a fellow of the Royal Academy. I wonder if I could just make a comment on carbon capture and sequestration as someone who worked on it for quite a number of years. The technologies of carbon capture are pretty well known and demonstrated. The reason they haven't been implemented in an economic sense is purely economic rather than technological. And the same goes for sequestration. Sue is absolutely right. We've had sequestration of natural gas and CO2 demonstrated. The reason that is not done is an economic one. And I think the examples of the BP attempt to sequester CO2 from the power station in Peterhead fell because there was no structure in place for adequately costing the sequestration. If government had structures there, I think that would be done. And really, I guess maybe the question to the panel arising from that is, why is government not supporting in the same way as it does other things, the proliferation of these technologies, and really make a difference rather than just setting targets and saying it will happen, but put in place the structure, the economic tax or emissions trading systems or pure subsidy that will bring it about.
Okay, so why isn't the government moving quicker? I mean, the Queen did announce that clean coal was going to be one of her government's things this year, but do you think they could be moving much quicker than this? On CCS, for example?
Yeah, I mean, government seems to want it both ways. It's proud of the fact that the UK has pretty much an open and free market in the energy sector, with private sector companies basically dictating what gets built where. But then it's concerned that the same group of private sector companies aren't, immediately jumping to meet the new policy objectives, because the incentives are just not there to make it happen. And we actually need a national plan, which is a plan that goes over, a decade or two, not a parliament or two, so that it can be cross-party. And which is difficult to achieve, I know, but this is so important. It's our national security and our national energy that's at stake here, and so my view is we should have some form of national plan that has cross-party consensus, in which the private sector can properly operate. But we're a million miles away from that at the moment.
Good luck with that.
Yeah.
Roger?
Yeah,
After you.
It's crazy, isn't it, that we still have an economy that doesn't price externalities in the way that we now understand them to cost. So, whether it's the cost of carbon on the environment, whether it's the clean-up cost of polluting a river, still we tend to ignore those. And I think while we continue to do that, we've really got an uphill struggle on our hands. And obviously you need a lot of international agreement on that. It is turning our economic basis slightly on its head, but it's not new news anymore, the need to do that. So yeah, that's something which whoever's in charge really should be talking about far more. But I think there are stepping stones which have got precedent, which, I just wish we were getting on with faster. Things like feed-in tariffs. I know the government is still equivocating about what those are going to be in April, but I'm probably you're familiar with those, but this is the idea that they have it in Germany and a number of other European countries, where if you generate renewable energy, whether it's on the roof of your house or your office or in your field or anywhere else, you're guaranteed that you'll be able to sell any surplus back to the grid at a considerable premium. So in Germany, you can sell renewable energy at a price 4 times higher than you would be buying it. And I think in the year after that was introduced in Germany, domestic renewable energy generation went up 25-fold. And they're now leading the world in renewable energy production. Things like that are not, I don't think, going to be politically difficult to do in the current climate.
Okay, let's take a couple more questions now. There's one here and one at the back as well.
Thank you. Can I come back to nuclear issues, really to ask about the availability of fuel for nuclear processors, particularly on a global scale? To what extent can nuclear fusion, we're talking about really, contribute to the global need for energy in the coming years?
Okay, that's a question about...
Say something about fission as well, I don't know.
That's a question about nuclear fusion. Just hold that thought for a second, panel. We're just going to go for one more question at the back, and then we'll get to answer both at the same time.
Just to talk about students as well at the moment and the kind of education within engineering, because I don't know enough about that at all. I'm a fashion student at the University of Arts London, and in terms of the design and arts student kind of education environment, that only really starting to scratch the surface on sustainability. So I was wondering if you could, or if you knew of any projects within engineering students who are really pushing sustainability, and if they're collaborating with any other education establishments, basically nationwide, to try and get the ball rolling with this.
Okay, so the first of those questions about fusion. Sue?
Yeah, I mean, on fusion, it's still going to be of the order of 2050 before we actually see a proven fusion power plant that will deliver electricity, economically to the grid. And there's a long way to go before that is actually that's actually realised. There are still some very significant engineering challenges ahead. So, provided all goes well on the current fast track to fusion, then that sort of power station, would then be available in the post-2050 era. But we still have to work out, the economics and the, availability, reliability, and get it to the point where it can be deployed as a matter of routine. So, we're not going to see it even with a fair wind in any large-scale deployment, probably till 2070, 2080 would be my guess. Okay.
So can I ask a quick question on fusion? Fusion seems to have been around for at least 50 years, but it's always been 50 years away every time anyone talks about it. Are we really going to see it as a source of energy this century? Is it really going to happen?
Yeah, I mean, I think that there's a good chance that it will. It's not guaranteed. And the 50-year timescale, 40-year timescale is now probably realistic, whereas historically it wasn't. Because most of the science of fusion is pretty much sorted out. The difficulty and the challenge ahead is to engineer a commercially viable energy source as opposed to proving the concept. So the challenge is in engineering and in materials. It's not in the physics. So my judgment is that we probably will see a fusion power station on a 2050 timeframe.
Very good. And the second question was about how engineers are maybe interacting with other sectors of society to try and get some of the sustainability messages forward. Who would like to take that one on?
Shall I talk about some of the things we do with engineering students in Lancaster, where we run low-carbon energy programs. We have students who've gone into schools to help schools reduce the school energy consumption, and where they've been working with both primary school children and secondary school children. We've had various students working with local groups on designing various types of processor for making biofuels out of waste. We've had students working on different control strategies for hybrid vehicles. This isn't so much with local communities, but sort of as a student project. We've involved people with doing carbon footprints of local businesses, working with local businesses, not just the sort of big factory type of business, but with the smaller, sometimes consultancies, sometimes rural enterprise type of businesses. So there's plenty of stuff going on where engineering students are actually getting pretty heavily involved in projects with the local community. Oh, well, I've just remembered, a group worked with a local laundry to sort of reschedule some of their activities to reduce the total amount of water and energy used by the laundry. So we try to involve students, but again, it makes a small difference. It doesn't make the big dramatic differences that suddenly switching all your cars onto electricity would actually make.
Joanna?
Just a quick comment actually on fashion. I don't know the extent to which your course includes sustainability, but there's a very good organisation called the Ethical Fashion Forum that specialises in making the links between the sustainability agenda and the fashion industry, and they work a lot with students and do some fantastic work on everything from materials and manufacturing through to whole life cycles and so on. So if that's your field, then there are lots of things to think about in your field as well.
Okay, we're coming to the end of our questions. I mean, do we have time for one more, or maybe one really short question? If it's there's one here, keep it short. That'd be great.
I'll finish if I can.
Okay. Did you want to just if you can keep it short, that'd be great.
Hi, this question is for Sue.
Do you want to hold it closer?
Sure. I appreciate your points about politicians not taking it under consideration engineering capabilities. How far away are we from what politicians expect the engineers to do to sort of reduce emissions sufficiently by 2050?
So how far are we from what politicians expect? Yeah, from an engineering point of view. And just one more question there.
Is it switched on?
It's working.
Right. I want to finish on giving you some food for thought, because you said at the start of your presentation that, in fact, the science was proved. You actually made that statement, didn't you?
No, I said that we're not going to discuss the science.
Or it wasn't on discussion. Well, I would ask people to actually look at what is happening to the science on the atmosphere, because this year there have been some very significant papers written on what is happening to radiation and what is happening to the atmosphere as well. And so I would ask you to watch the science, because it is saying that the IPCC models were significantly flawed. The science is changing things.
Okay, well, Sue, did you want to take the first question?
Yeah, I mean, on the question about how far away is the engineering from political reality? I mean, I think it's a long way away, because just the very fact that we have targets like 80% reduction by 2050. And we're nearly at 2010, and we're worse off than we were in 2000. So we're going the wrong way, and every year we delay makes the situation worse, because you can't catch up. So I just think that we're a million miles away from what they think we can achieve, because they haven't actually asked the engineering community, what's possible and how can it be delivered.
Roger, are we miles and miles and miles away?
I think it's rather good to say, let's eliminate sin, or let's have some really big plan that says, from now on in, we're not going to do whatever. And I feel that the politicians are something like that. I don't believe a target is binding and a commitment unless, firstly, there is a sanction should you not meet it, and secondly, that it's actually been resourced in order to make it happen. And I think a lot of the targets we're seeing at the moment within the political sphere are not plausible targets. They're targets where people have pulled a number out of the air and said, well, David Cameron says we can do 80%, so we'll do 80% too, without the slightest clue how it's going to be implemented. And I'm exceptionally sceptical about it. I mean, I think engineers can make a difference, but we certainly need some realistic targets and some view of realistic funding. At the moment, I've not seen either of those.
Okay, thank you, Roger. Did you want to add any more, Joanna?
Yeah, just not on engineering specifically, although that's part of the mix, just in the way that the government is actually treating this agenda right now, it's incredibly unjoined up. I work a lot in development, and at the moment, for example, the transport policy for the UK is predicated on a 30% growth in road traffic in the next 15 years. So our road infrastructure is currently being designed to accommodate 30% more cars in the next 15 years. And all the models show that more roads bring more traffic. And then meanwhile, they're asking engineers to come up with clever solutions to eliminate the impacts of that. So I'm afraid we've still got very, very unjoined up thinking from the top.
Don't forget the third runway at Heathrow either. Okay, well, before we wind up, we're going to rattle through those questions in that quiz from earlier as well. So we're going to ask the same questions again. And after you've heard this very informed and gentle debate, let's see if you've changed some of your minds. So the first question, just to remind you, was: it would be easy for me to halve my family's transport mileage. And remember, vote 1 for strongly agree, 2 for slightly agree, neither disagree is 3, slightly disagree is 4, or strongly disagree is 5. You can start voting now. In the first round of this, most of you voted 4 and 5. Slightly disagree, strongly disagree. So, let's see what the results are. Any second now. See if most of you decided you can change. No, I think you're still, roughly speaking, actually more of you are strongly disagreeing with that question this time round. So, in fact, more of you, 35% before, now it's 41%. So, I don't know what that says. Roger, you've got quite a job ahead of you. Okay, question number 2. If everyone did their bit to reduce carbon emissions, we would get out of this crisis. If everyone did their bit to reduce carbon emissions, we'd get out of this crisis. You can vote now. The last time round, 41% of you said you neither disagree nor agree, and about 23% said you strongly disagree. So let's see if Joanna's managed to persuade you. And the answers are... Well, more people now agree that if we all do our bit, that's good, and that we'd be able to do something. The number 3 is reduced from 41 to 12%, so I think we've had a bit of an impact there. That's good. Okay, question number 3. The government doesn't give us enough information on how to reduce our household energy consumption. The government doesn't give us enough information on how to reduce our household energy consumption. Let's start voting now. In the last round, actually most of you, just over half of you thought that was true. Let's see what happens this time round. I can't imagine the government's come in and said anything right now, so you probably think the same thing, right? Okay. Yep, it's roughly the same. So most of you still think the government doesn't give us any information. Question number 4. Show me the money and I'll insulate my loft and put solar panels on my roof. So if you want to vote now. Now, 51% of you strongly agreed with that. 21% slightly agreed. Neither disagreed nor agree was about 14%. So let's see if anything's changed this time. Okay, the answers for this one. Oh, even more of you think that would like the money to put those things on your roof. Great. Well, that's good news. Okay, question number 5. Nuclear power. We need nuclear power. I can't believe people can't see how green it is. Last time round, quite a few, about 40% of you thought that you strongly agreed or slightly agreed with it. So let's vote again. So the numbers last time round were 20% of you strongly agreed, 23% slightly agreed, 14% neither disagreed nor agreed, and the remainder were on the negative side. So we need nuclear power. I can't believe people can't see how green it is. This time round? Oh, wow. 46%. Even more of you think nuclear power is a good thing. It's time to make the case even stronger, I think. Okay, the final question. I'd be prepared to cut down eating meat by half to reduce methane emissions. You can vote now. Last time round, just to remind you, 40% of you said you strongly agreed with that. 18% of you said you slightly agreed. 25% of you said you'd strongly disagree with that. So some of you are carnivores, clearly. Okay. This time round, let's see what happens. Oh, well, there's even slightly more of you want to actually reduce your meat consumption. And the 25% of you who were carnivores last time reduced to 17. That's interesting. Okay, well, thanks a lot for all of that. Thanks a lot for... I just wanted to round up now. Slightly over time, so I'll try and keep this short. I think that what we've learned here is that not only is it going to take huge amounts of political action, ingenious ideas by engineers to come up with ways to cut our carbon footprints, but also it's up to us, even if what we do isn't going to make a massive percentage shaving on the UK's carbon emissions, it certainly gives the government an idea that we are all interested and forces them in negotiations like Copenhagen to say, look, this is what our country wants. We're going to push for stronger targets. There are campaigns like the 10-10 target, which does do exactly that. Now, I think that it's interesting that some of you changed your minds over the course of this discussion. So clearly, there's things that we can all be doing to persuade others along the same sorts of lines. It just remains for me to thank the Dana Centre for hosting this event, to our speakers for their excellent sort of advice, and for you all for coming. Thanks a lot. And also, just one final thing. Remember to fill in your feedback forms and put them in that Perspex box on the bar there. Thanks a lot.